Welcome everyone to the Volunteers Stakeholders Group side event for this year's UN High-Level Political Forum. This session is hosted by the Volunteer Groups Alliance with United Nations Volunteers. My name is May Cobb, and I am the co-chair of the Volunteer Groups Alliance and Senior Director of Volunteer Engagement at United Way Worldwide. Hola. Bonjour, guten tag, konnichiwa. We welcome attendees from around the world and thank you for what you do as volunteers and to support volunteering in your countries and in your communities. Today, we will be focusing on volunteering and COVID-19, how volunteers help build back better during the pandemic to achieve the 2030 agenda. COVID-19 has highlighted how the 1 billion volunteers globally are helping communities respond to the pandemic. Sustainable and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic requires volunteering to promote the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, and volunteers are building an inclusive and effective path for the achievement of the 2030 agenda in the context of the Decade of Action and Delivery for Sustainable Development. The Volunteer Groups Alliance is a global coalition of organizations that contribute to sustainable development through volunteering. The Alliance supports its member organizations to promote the contribution that volunteers make to sustainable development and to gain recognition for the important role volunteers play at the local, regional, and national levels, and in the UN processes. The Volunteer Groups Alliance came together in 2013 following a UNV stakeholder meeting and the annual IVCO conference to advocate for the support and recognition of volunteering in the Sustainable Development Goals. And each July at the HLPF, the Volunteer Groups Alliance submits a position paper and hosts a side event to amplify the voice of volunteers in delivering the SDGs. In our position paper this year, we, as the stakeholder group representing volunteers, offered 5 recommendations to the UN member states. 1, to formally recognize the contributions of volunteering to the implementation of the SDGs in the member states' VNR, their voluntary national reviews, to ensure the volunteer groups are fully recognized and supported in national plans and strategies for implementing the 2030 agenda. 3, affirm the full support for the participation of non-governmental actors as contributors to and beneficiaries of policies that will allow us all to work towards the 2030 agenda. 4, ensure the accountability, the transparency, and review framework for the SDG involves community consultation at all levels, including representation of the most marginalized voices, as well as the volunteers who work closely with them. And 5, and particularly after this past year, to formally recognize the role of volunteering in crisis prevention, management, and resolution. As we know, volunteers and groups organizing volunteers, like many of you, are working daily to meet the SDGs in local communities and are at the front lines of COVID-19 relief, climate change action, and other extraordinary situations. So today, we recognize and celebrate how volunteers are helping build back better. This virtual side event will share research findings on volunteering during COVID-19, coupled with the real-life experience of volunteer organizations and governments around the world to inform UNV's State of the World's Volunteerism report on volunteering and the new social contract. Every 3 years, UNV produces the State of the World's Volunteerism Report, which is a flagship UN publication designed to strengthen understanding on volunteering and to demonstrate its universality, scope, and its reach in the 21st century. The last report was in 2018, so we are excited that the new report will be released later this year. So with that background, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first three speakers representing governments. And then we will hear from volunteering experts, as well as some wonderful stories from some incredible volunteers working on the ground to solve serious social problems. First, we will welcome Asetu Balde, who since February has served as the Minister of Youth and Youth Employment of the Republic of Guinea. Prior to that, she was Minister of Environment, Water and Forests, as well as Minister Advisor to the President of the Republic, member of the Economic Pool, and member of the National Council of Regulation of Posts and Telecommunications. Next, we will hear from Yen Delaney, who in March joined France Volontaires as General Delegate after having served as Secretary General of Atout France, the state operator in charge of the development of tourism in France since 2017. Previously, he was Chief of Staff for the Secretary of State in charge of European Affairs, as well as for the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then we will conclude with Renata Santander Ramirez of Chile, National Director of the Instituto Nacional de la Juventud in the Ministerio de Desarrollo Social y Familia. She is a political scientist from Universidad Diego Portales. And before assuming her current role, she served as Chief of Staff of the National Directorate of the Social Welfare Institute. So now, please, let me turn it over to Minister Balde.
Monsieur le délégué général de France volontaire, Madame la représentante du gouvernement du Chili, Madame la coordinatrice exécutive adjointe du programme des volontaires des Nations Unies, Madame la présidente du conseil d'administration de United Way Worldwide, Monsieur, Madame, les représentants de la VGA, organisatrice de cet événement, chers panélistes en vos rangs et grades, tout protocole observé. C'est un honneur.
Mr. General Delegate of France Volontaire, Madame Representative of the Government of Chile, Mrs. Deputy Executive Coordinator of the United Nations Volunteers Program, Madame President of the Board of Directors of United Way Worldwide, Mr. and Mrs. Representatives of the VGA, organizer of this event, dear panelists, in your ranks and grades, all protocol observed.
C'est un honneur et un plaisir pour moi de prendre la parole au nom du gouvernement guinéen à cet événement qui se tient chaque année en marge du forum politique de haut niveau.
It is an honor and a pleasure for me to speak on behalf of the Guinean governments at this event, which is held every year on the margins of the high-level political forum.
Mon propos va se situer à deux niveaux. Comme nous le vivons tous, l'humanité entière fait face à une pandémie planétaire et je vais souligner le rôle essentiel du volontariat et de l'engagement citoyen dans la crise sanitaire actuelle et dans la réalisation des ODD.
My speech will be on two levels. As we are all experiencing, the whole of humanity is facing a global pandemic, and I will emphasize the essential role of volunteerism and citizen engagement in the current health crisis and in the achievement of the SDGs.
Mais avant tout propos, il me semble important de souligner le contexte général de l'engagement volontaire et solidaire en Guinée.
But first, I think it is important to highlight the general context of volunteerism and solidarity in Guinea.
Le gouvernement guinéen contribue à la construction d'un environnement favorable au développement du volontariat au travers d'une politique nationale qui a conduit à la mise en place d'une agence nationale de volontariat jeunesse en Guinée, UNV-Gallup.
The Guinean government is contributing to the construction of an environment favorable to the development of volunteerism through a national policy that has led to the establishment of a national agency for youth volunteerism in Guinea called UNV-Gallup.
À cet égard, le Parlement guinéen a voté le 30 mai 2015 la loi portant institution et réglementation du volontariat national jeunesse en République de Guinée. Cette même loi a été promulguée par le décret présidentiel du 4 juin 2015, transformant ainsi le service national du volontariat jeunesse en agence nationale du volontariat jeunesse ANVJ, établissement public à caractère administratif.
In this regard, the Guinean Parliament voted on May 30, 2015, the law on the institution and regulation of national youth volunteerism in the Republic of Guinea. This same law was promulgated by presidential decree on June 4, 2015, transforming the National Youth Volunteer Service into the National Youth Volunteer Agency, a public administrative establishment.
Une autre agence du service civique d'action pour le développement ASCAD, qui est un établissement public créé par décret en 2011, existe pour mettre en œuvre le service civique d'action pour le développement. La mission de celle-ci est de promouvoir l'éducation citoyenne des jeunes Guinéens et Guinéennes, de leur faire acquérir une qualification professionnelle en vue de faciliter leur insertion socio-économique.
There is another agency for civic service action for development, which is a public establishment created by decree in 2011 to implement civic service action for development. Its mission is to promote civic education for young Guineans and to help them acquire professional qualifications in order to facilitate their socio-economic integration.
La particularité de cette agence est de proposer à des jeunes volontaires une formation citoyenne suivie d'une formation professionnelle sous la direction d'un encadrement civilo-militaire. Le régime de vie des stagiaires est l'internat, mais leur statut est civil. La tutelle de l'ASCAD est exercée par la présidence de la République.
The particularity of this agency is to offer young volunteers civic education followed by a professional training under the direction of a civil military supervision. The trainees live in boarding houses, but their status is civilian.
De 2012 à 2019, 1400 jeunes ont été formés à Conakry, dont plus de 30% de jeunes filles, de femmes et 10% d'illettrés, avec un taux d'insertion socio-professionnelle global à 76,5%. À côté du volontariat national promu par les pouvoirs publics, il y a des structures associatives comme les scouts, les guides de Guinée, le mérite international de la jeunesse Guinée qui s'investissent dans la formation non formelle des jeunes et dans des travaux d'intérêt général avec 230 bénévoles communautaires par an, etc. De même, des centaines d'associations guinéennes agréées par l'État contribuent à la mise en œuvre des projets de développement communautaire.
From 2012 to 2019, 1,400 young people were trained in Conakry, including more than 30% of women. In addition to the National Volunteer Program promoted by the government, there are associations such as the Scouts, the Guides of Guinea, the International Merit of Guinea Youth, which are involved in non-formal training of young people and in community service with 230 community volunteers per year. Similarly, hundreds of Guinean associations approved by the state contribute to the implementation of community development projects.
Pour le gouvernement guinéen, l'expérience de volontariat constitue l'une des réponses à la problématique de l'insertion socio-professionnelle et économique des jeunes, mais aussi facteur qui favorise leur participation citoyenne. Le volontariat constitue une expérience qui doit être valorisée dans un parcours professionnel et personnel comme une période d'acquisition de compétences formelles, non formelles et informelles, de savoir-faire et de savoir-être.
For the Guinean government, the experience of volunteering is one of the answers to the problem of professional and economic integration of young people, but also a factor that promotes their participation in society. Volunteering is an experience that should be valued in a professional and personal career as a period of acquisition of skills, formal, non-formal, and informal, knowledge, know-how, and interpersonal skills.
En Guinée, la lutte contre la pandémie de COVID-19 a engendré une forte participation des jeunes volontaires et bénévoles qui se sont engagés massivement dans la sensibilisation et la distribution des kits sanitaires pour le respect des mesures barrières. Ils ont joué le rôle de relais du gouvernement et de ses partenaires dans ces différentes opérations.
In Guinea, the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic has generated a strong participation of volunteers who have been massively involved in the sensitization of distribution of health kits for the respect of barrier measures. They played the role of relays for the government and its partner in these different operations.
Ces opérations ont été financées par le gouvernement guinéen. Le projet à venir, Action des volontaires européens et nationaux et investis pour la résilience, et le projet Sanitaire Ville propre d'Enabel, mais surtout aussi ceux de nombreux donateurs privés guinéens.
These operations were financed by the Guinean government, the Avenir Project, which stands for Action des volontaires européens et nationaux et investis pour la résilience, and the Sanita Clean City Project of Enable, but also by many private Guinean donors.
Mais surtout aussi ceux de nombreux donateurs privés. Il faut également souligner l'intervention de la Croix-Rouge avec ses 17 156 bénévoles, ainsi que les volontaires de France Volontaire et de l'ANVJ à travers le projet à venir. Cet engagement bénévole et volontaire a permis de mieux gérer cette crise et je voudrais saisir cette occasion pour saluer l'engagement de nos jeunes et des volontaires internationaux.
We must also highlight the intervention of the Red Cross with its 17,156 volunteers, the volunteers of France Volontaire and the National Agency through the Avenir Project. This voluntary commitment has helped to better manage this crisis, and I would like to take the opportunity to salute the commitment of our youth and international volunteers.
Le volontariat occupe aujourd'hui une place importante dans le processus de développement des pays, en particulier la Guinée, où un grand nombre de volontaires sont sur le terrain et interviennent dans divers domaines auprès des communautés, corps de la paix, volontaires des Nations Unies, ANVJ et dans de diverses structures. Nonobstant ce rôle capital que le volontariat joue, force est de constater qu'il est parfois négligé dans l'élaboration des plans de développement.
Volunteering today occupies an important place in the development process of countries, particularly in Guinea, where a large number of volunteers are on the ground and intervene in various fields with communities and in various structures. However, it should be noted that the process of defining the indicators for monitoring the SDGs was very technical and not very open to civil society.
Ceci dit, il faut noter que le processus de définition des indicateurs de suivi des ODD a été très technique et peu ouvert à la société civile. Ces indicateurs ont été adoptés en mars 2016 par la Commission statistique des Nations Unies. Aucun de ces indicateurs ne permet de mesurer l'apport de l'engagement citoyen et du volontariat à la mise en œuvre des ODD.
These indicators were adopted in March 2016 by the United Nations Statistical Commission, None of these indicators measure the contribution of civic engagement and volunteerism to the implementation of the SDGs.
Il est nécessaire que dans le cadre de suivi des ODD, les organisations de volontariat soient associées au travail des agences statistiques nationales pour rendre compte de leurs propres contributions et apports.
It is necessary that, and in the framework of the monitoring of the SDGs, volunteer organizations be associated with the work of national statistical agencies in order to report on their own contribution.
Toutefois, pour le PNDS 2, le Plan national de développement économique et social 2, 2021-2025, un grand travail est mené actuellement par les organisations de volontariat réunies au sein du COVOG, collectif des organisations de volontariat en Guinée, sous le leadership de l'UNV-Gallup, pour qu'on tienne compte de la contribution des volontaires dans ce plan quinquennal. J'appuie moi-même cette démarche sans faille.
However, for the second National Plan of Development for the period 2021-2025, a great work is currently being carried out by volunteer organizations gathered within the COVOG, Collective of Volunteer Organizations in Guinea, under the leadership of the national agency UNV-Gallup, so that the contribution of volunteers in this 5-year plan is taken into account. I myself unfailingly support this approach.
En 2018, le gouvernement guinéen a reconnu la contribution des volontaires dans la mise en œuvre des ODD dans son rapport national volontaire au forum politique de haut niveau à New York grâce au travail des organisations nationales et internationales des volontaires.
In 2018, the Guinean government recognized the contribution of volunteers in the implementation of the SDGs in its voluntary national report at the high-level political forum in New York, thanks to the work of national and international volunteer organizations.
Toutes les organisations de volontariat nationales et internationales ont priorisé les cibles des ODD ayant trait à notre secteur pour les 5 prochaines années, notamment l'objectif numéro 17, renforcer les moyens de mettre en œuvre le partenariat mondial pour le développement durable et le revitaliser.
All national and international volunteer organizations have prioritized SDG targets relevant to our sector for the next 5 years, including the SDGs 17, strengthen capacity to implement and revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development.
L'objectif numéro 17 mentionne explicitement les associations de volontaires en tant que partenaires d'exécution de l'ensemble des objectifs, et cet objectif nous semble le plus prioritaire.
And still on the SDG 17, explicitly mentions volunteer organizations as implementing partners for all of the goals. And this goal seems to us to be the highest priority.
Exemple. En Guinée, les volontaires fournissent une expertise technique, par exemple dans les domaines de la santé, objectif numéro 3, de l'éducation, objectif numéro 4, de l'eau salubre et de l'assainissement, objectif numéro 6, des énergies renouvelables, objectif numéro 7, et des écosystèmes durables, objectif numéro 13, 14 et 15, des personnes vulnérables, handicapés, enfants, etc.
For example, in Guinea, volunteers provide technical expertise in the areas of health, SDG 3, education, SDG 4, clean water and sanitation, SDG 6, renewable energy, SDG 7, and sustainable ecosystem, SDG 13, 14, and 15, vulnerable people, such as disabled children, and so on.
Il contribue à renforcer les compétences et les capacités, en particulier des jeunes et des personnes éloignées du marché de l'emploi, améliorant ainsi leur employabilité. Objectif numéro 8 et tous les objectifs. Il en est de même des volontaires nationaux et internationaux qui travaillent auprès des communautés locales.
They contribute to building skills and capacities, especially of young people and people far from the labor market, thus improving their employability. linked to SDG 8 and all the other goals. The same applies to national and international volunteers working with local communities.
Les efforts sont déployés par les organisations nationales et internationales pour intégrer les objectifs de développement durable dans nos politiques, stratégies, plans d'action et programmes de développement.
Moreover,
En 2017, France Volontaire a défini son nouveau cadre stratégique pour les 3 années à venir. L'agenda 2030 est aussi le cadre de référence de l'action de France Volontaire à partir duquel se définissent les axes de travail de l'organisation.
Moreover, efforts are made by national and international organizations to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals into our policies, strategies, action plans, and development programs. In 2017, France Volontaire also defined its strategic framework for the next 3 years, in which the 2030 agenda is also the reference framework for its action and work axes.
Il en est de même des autres structures, Croix-Rouge, UNV, Peace Corps.
The same applies to other structures such as Red Cross, UNV, and Peace Corps.
La principale difficulté aujourd'hui est de mesurer l'impact de l'action des volontaires à travers le monde. Malgré une mobilisation importante des organisations de volontariat pendant le processus de définition des indicateurs de suivi des ODD par la Commission statistique des Nations Unies, aucun indicateur adopté ne permet de mesurer la contribution des volontaires à l'atteinte des ODD.
The main challenge today is to measure the impact of volunteer action around the world. Despite a significant mobilization of volunteer organizations during the process of defining indicators for monitoring the SDGs by the United Nations Statistical Commission, no indicator has been adopted to measure the contribution of volunteers to the SDGs.
Pour qu'elle soit reconnue et valorisée par les gouvernements, la contribution des volontaires doit être mesurée et documentée. Ce travail qui doit rassembler un très large nombre d'acteurs, organisations de volontariat, VNU, pouvoirs publics, statisticiens, est aujourd'hui un chantier complexe à lancer. Il nécessite en amont une très forte appropriation du cadre ODD par les acteurs.
In order to be recognized and valued by governments, the contribution of volunteers must be measured and documented. This work, which must bring together a very large number of actors, volunteer organizations, UNV, public authorities, statisticians, is a complex task to launch today. It requires a very strong ownership of the SDG framework by the actors.
À l'issue de ce processus, les lacunes, les solutions, les besoins et les domaines dans lesquels le renforcement de capacités sont nécessaires sont dans le domaine de la réponse aux crises climatiques, humanitaires, articulation entre le volontariat local. Les volontaires locaux sont les premiers mobilisés en cas de crise et les volontaires internationaux. Le projet à venir mis en œuvre par France Volontaire de 2019 à 2021 est une des réponses apportées à ce domaine. Dans le domaine de la formation citoyenne, notamment des jeunes et femmes.
At the end of this process, it will remain gaps, solutions to find, needs, and areas in which capacity building is necessary. In the field of crisis response, whether climatic or humanitarian, we could rely more on the articulation between local volunteering. Local volunteers are the first to be mobilized in case of crisis, and international volunteers. The Avenir project, implemented by France Volontaire from 2019 to 2021, is one of the responses to this concern. In the field of civic education, we could emphasize particularly for young people and women.
Vive la coopération internationale, vive le volontariat international et réciproque. Je vous remercie.
Long life to international cooperation, long life international and reciprocal volunteering. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Balde. I'd like to now turn it over to Yen Delaney.
Bonjour à tous. Madame la ministre de la Jeunesse et de l'Emploi des Jeunes de la République de Guinée, Madame la directrice nationale de l'Institut national de la jeunesse du Chili, Madame la coordinatrice exécutive adjointe du programme des volontaires des Nations Unies, chers membres de la Volunteer Group Alliance, chers volontaires aux quatre coins du monde, mesdames et messieurs. Je suis très heureux de participer aujourd'hui à ce panel de haut niveau pour partager avec vous l'expérience de France Volontaire, la manière dont notre organisation s'est adaptée pendant cette période si singulière que nous venons de traverser et dont les effets perdurent aujourd'hui et pour une durée encore indéterminée.
Her Excellency, the Minister of Youth and Employment of the Republic of Guinea, Madam National Director of the National Youth Institute of Chile, Madam Deputy Executive Coordinator of the United Nations Volunteers Program, dear members of the Volunteer Groups Alliance, dear volunteers from all over the world, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to participate today in this high-level panel to share with you the experience of France Volontaire, the way our organization has adapted during this particular period we have just gone through, and whose effects are still felt today and for an undetermined period of time.
Le ministère français de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères m'a chargé de vous transmettre son soutien pour cet événement parrainé par la France. Le volontariat international est en effet l'une des composantes essentielles de la collaboration du ministère avec les organisations de la société civile dans le cadre de sa politique de coopération et de solidarité internationale. Ils étaient plus de 8500 sur le terrain en 2019 à apporter leur contribution au plus près des communautés à travers le dispositif français de volontariat international, d'échange et de solidarité.
The French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs has asked me to convey its support for this event sponsored by France. International volunteering is indeed one of the essential components of the ministry's collaboration with civil society organizations in the framework of its policy of cooperation and international solidarity. More than 8,500 volunteers were in the field in 2019, making their contribution to communities through the French International Volunteer Exchange and Solidarity programs.
La crise sanitaire mondiale a renforcé la prise de conscience de la nécessité, dans ce monde commun, d'un effort accru de solidarité, et notamment à l'international. Les impacts de la COVID-19 sur nos sociétés sont inexorables, entraînant de graves répercussions sociales et économiques.
The global health crisis has heightened awareness of the need in this shared world for an increased solidarity effort, particularly internationally. The impacts of COVID-19 on our societies are inexorable, with serious social and economic repercussions.
La fermeture des frontières a mis un coup d'arrêt à la mobilité internationale, impactant immédiatement les organisations de volontaires, les programmes de volontariat et les volontaires eux-mêmes. Pourtant, des initiatives se sont développées et les volontaires ont joué un rôle primordial en réponse à la crise.
The closing of borders has put a stop to international mobility, immediately impacting volunteer organizations, volunteer programs, and the volunteers themselves. However, initiatives have been developed and the volunteers have played a key role in responding to the crisis.
Selon une étude de France Volontaire, les volontaires internationaux ont continué d'apporter des contributions importantes aux pays d'accueil dans le cadre de la lutte contre la pandémie et ses conséquences, soit en choisissant de rester sur place, parfois en réorientant leur mission, soit en continuant à œuvrer avec des partenaires par le biais du volontariat à distance après leur rapatriement.
According to a study by France Volontaire, international volunteers continue to make important contributions to host countries in the fight against the pandemic and its consequences, either by choosing to stay on site and sometimes reorienting their mission, or by continuing to work with partners through distance volunteering after their repatriation.
Plus d'un tiers des missions soutenues par les dispositifs français a pu être maintenu en présentiel et seulement 10% des missions ont dû être interrompus.
More than a third of the missions supported by the French programs have been maintained in the field, and only 10% of the missions had to be interrupted.
Collecte de dons, distribution de vivres et de kits d'hygiène, actions d'information et de sensibilisation, les volontaires ont adapté leurs priorités et leur champ d'action pour apporter leur aide au plus près des communautés, aussi bien dans le cadre de leur mission que sur leur temps personnel.
Collecting donations, distributing food and hygiene kits, informing and raising awareness, volunteers have adapted their priorities and their field of action to bring their help closer to the communities, both within the framework of their mission and on their own time.
Santé, mais aussi éducation et formation, activités génératrices de revenus, eau et assainissement, gestion des déchets, égalité femmes-hommes au quotidien. Les volontaires participent à la mise en œuvre de projets dans des champs et sur des thématiques très diverses.
Health, but also education and training, income generating activities, water and sanitation, waste management, gender equality. On a daily basis, volunteers participate in the implementation of projects in a wide range of fields and on variety of themes.
Ils et elles contribuent activement à l'atteinte des objectifs de développement durable. Nous le savons et nous en sommes témoins au quotidien sur le terrain.
They actively contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We know this and we see it every day in the field.
Dans le but de passer de l'illustration à la démonstration, France Volontaire et ses membres ont dans ce sens travaillé près d'1 an et demi sur une première étude expérimentale sur la contribution du volontariat international d'échange et de solidarité à l'agenda 2030, dont le rapport a été publié en mai dernier. Il s'agit de la première enquête française sur le sujet.
In order to move from illustration to demonstration, France Volontaire and its members have been working for almost a year and a half on a first experimental study on the contribution of international volunteering for exchange and solidarity to the 2030 agenda, whose report was published last May. This is the first French study on the subject.
Cette étude avait pour objectif d'observer cette contribution et d'en développer une méthode d'analyse. Elle s'est intéressée plus particulièrement à l'ODD 4, Éducation pour tous, avec un focus sur Madagascar.
The objectives of this study were to observe this contribution and to develop an analyze method. It focused on the SDG 4, Education for All, with a focus on Madagascar.
Divers enseignements ont pu être dressés autour de 5 enjeux que vous retrouverez dans le rapport final et ses synthèses qui sont disponibles en français, en anglais et en espagnol.
Various lessons have been drawn around 5 issues, which you will find in the final report and summaries, which are available in French, English, and Spanish.
Premier constat, la compréhension de la méconnaissance et la reconnaissance de l'agenda 2030. Près de 75% des personnes interrogées connaissent peu ou pas l'agenda 2030, alors que les 3/4 d'entre eux considèrent ce cadre utile une fois qu'il leur est expliqué.
First observation, the understanding of the lack of knowledge and recognition of the 2030 agenda. Nearly 75% of respondents know little or nothing about the 2030 agenda, while 3/4 of them nevertheless consider this framework useful once it is explained to them.
Deuxième constat, la difficile intégration de l'agenda 2030 dans les cadres des partenaires ou l'évaluation de la plus-value des volontaires. Les acteurs du volontariat se saisissent assez peu de l'agenda 2030 au détriment d'autres cadres du développement pour élaborer leurs objectifs et ceux des volontaires.
Second observation, the difficulty of integrating the 2030 agenda into partner frameworks or assessing the added values of volunteers. Volunteer actors make little use of the 2030 agenda to the detriment of other development frameworks to develop their objectives and those of volunteers.
Troisième Constat, les contributions protéiformes des volontaires. Lorsqu'on essaie de mesurer la contribution des volontaires à un ODD spécifique, on se rend compte qu'ils et elles participent plus largement à l'agenda 2030, y compris sur des temps en dehors de leur mission.
Third observation, the protean contributions of volunteers. When we try to measure the contribution of volunteers to a specific SDG, we realize that they participate more broadly in the 2030 agenda, including during times outside their missions.
Quatrième constat, l'importance du réseau d'acteurs du volontariat, qui est un véritable écosystème regroupant une pluralité d'acteurs, tels que des structures d'envoi, des structures d'accueil, des bénévoles locaux, et dont les volontaires internationaux sont des pierres angulaires.
Fourth observation, the importance of the network of volunteer actors, which is a real ecosystem bringing together a plurality of actors, such as standing structures, host structures, local volunteers, and of which international volunteers are the cornerstones.
Cinquième et dernier constat, les formes de contribution du volontariat à l'ODD 4 qui sont diverses, aussi bien au niveau macro avec le renforcement des partenariats ou l'accompagnement de projets qu'au niveau micro avec les innovations qu'apportent les volontaires, notamment en termes de pédagogie, ou encore le renforcement des compétences des acteurs locaux.
Fifth and last observation, the forms of contribution of volunteering to SDG 4 are diverse, both at the macro level with the strengthening of partnerships or the support of projects, and at the micro level with the innovations that volunteers bring, particularly in terms of pedagogy or the strengthening of the skills of local actors.
Le volontariat joue déjà et jouera à l'avenir un rôle important pour mieux reconstruire nos sociétés après cette pandémie mondiale.
Volunteering already plays and will continue to play an important role in rebuilding our societies after this global pandemic.
Par les innovations qu'il apporte, les ponts qu'il crée, les liens humains qu'il tisse et l'ouverture d'esprit qu'il amène, le volontariat, notamment dans ses dimensions internationales et réciproques, saura se réinventer, s'adapter et contribuer à l'émergence de sociétés plus durables, plus justes, plus solidaires.
Through the innovations it brings, the bridges it creates, the human links it forges, and the open-mindedness it brings, volunteering, especially in its international and reciprocal dimensions, will be able to reinvent itself, adapt, and contribute to the emergence of more sustainable, fairer, and more united societies.
France Volontaire s'efforcera de continuer à jouer son rôle ensemblier pour accompagner et développer la mise en œuvre de politiques publiques et d'initiatives multi-acteurs favorisant l'engagement citoyen en France et à l'international.
France Volontaire will strive to continue to play its role as an umbrella organization to support and develop the implementation of public policies and multi-stakeholder initiatives, promoting civic engagement in France and internationally.
Naturellement, ce travail se fait en lien étroit avec les autorités de nos pays partenaires, comme c'est déjà le cas avec Madame Assiatou Baldé en Guinée, que je remercie pour son implication.
This work is done in close collaboration with the authorities of our partner countries, as it is already the case with Her Excellency Mrs. Assiatou Baldé in Guinea, and I thank her for her support.
Je vous remercie.
I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jen Villeneuve. We really appreciate your comments. And now I'd like to turn it over to Renata Santander Ramirez.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes, amigas y amigos presentes en este gran encuentro en nombre del voluntariado. Mi nombre es Renata Santander y soy la directora nacional del Instituto Nacional de la Juventud.
Good afternoon, friends and colleagues present today at this great meeting in the name of volunteering. My name is Renata Santander, and I am the National Director of Chile's National Institute of Youth in HUF.
INJUV Chile orienta su trabajo a las y los jóvenes entre 15 y 29 años, coordinando las políticas públicas de juventud que se originan precisamente en el Estado, y precisamente a contar del año 2012, INJUV viene desarrollando el voluntariado como un eje de trabajo estratégico que busca fomentar la participación social de las juventudes y crear experiencias significativas de aprendizaje e impacto en el territorio.
INJUV works with and for young people between 15 and 29 years old, coordinating public youth policies that originate in the state. Starting in 2012, INJUV has been developing volunteering as a strategic line of work, promoting the social participation of youth and creating meaningful learning experiences and impact in the territory.
Parte de esa experiencia es lo que hoy deseamos compartir con todos ustedes, que es desde el 2019, INJUV impulsa el Catastro Nacional de Organizaciones de Voluntariado que busca identificar y caracterizar a la mayor cantidad de organizaciones y su oferta de voluntariado existentes en nuestro país que contribuyan a los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible ODS. Se logró registrar más de 1.200 organizaciones y evidenciar que, si bien internacionalmente se observa que la importancia del voluntariado respecto del cumplimiento de los objetivos, es preocupante el bajo o nulo conocimiento de las organizaciones respecto a estos objetivos. Los datos nos muestran que el 74% de las organizaciones analizadas declaran conocer poco o muy poco o bien nada respecto de la Agenda 2030 y los ODS. Es por esto que el INJUV Chile considera relevante las siguientes acciones para poder reforzar esta importante agenda global. En primer lugar, es necesario que las instituciones públicas pongan un mayor énfasis en la Agenda 2030, haciendo una mayor promoción de los objetivos y las herramientas para poder alcanzarlos.
In 2019, we promoted the National Registry of Volunteering Organizations. This resource helped identify and characterize the large number of organizations and their volunteer offerings in the country that contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. It was possible to register more than 1,200 organizations, evidencing that although the importance of volunteer with respect to the fulfillment of the goals is well observed internationally, the limited or lack of knowledge of national organizations regarding them is worrying. The data shows that 74% of the organizations analyzed stated that they know little, very little, or nothing about the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. This is why INJUV Chile considers the following actions relevant to reinforce this important global agenda. In the first place, it is necessary for public institutions to place greater emphasis on the 2030 Agenda, making greater promotion of the goals and the tools to achieve them.
¿Cómo entonces desde la institución pública seguimos impulsando los ODS en tiempos de pandemia? En este sentido, visto nuestra perspectiva, creemos que a pesar de la pandemia hemos logrado adaptar nuestra oferta y seguir colaborando en el desarrollo de la Agenda 2030, y para ello hemos impulsado 3 programas pilares. El primero, en el ámbito de la formación, hemos lanzado un concurso en modalidad e-learning para gestores de proyectos sociales o de voluntariado, en donde incluimos módulos de introducción a la Agenda 2030 para que puedan ser considerados dentro de sus programas. 2, en el ámbito de la colaboración, hemos generado mesas de trabajo a nivel regional con organizaciones locales que han tenido el desafío de visualizar problemáticas locales, relacionándolas con los ODS y por tanto generando así aprendizaje desde la aplicación de los ODS en su propia realidad.
How do we, as a public institution, continue then to promote the SDGs in the time of pandemic? In this sense, given our perspective, we believe that despite the pandemic, we have managed to adapt our offer and continue collaborating in the development of the 2030 Agenda. For this, we have promoted 3 pillar programs. In the field of training, we have launched an e-learning course for managers of social or volunteer projects, where we include introductory models to the 2030 agenda so that we can consider them within their programs. In the field of collaboration, we have generated work tables at the regional level. At the regional level with local organizations that have had the challenge of visualizing local problems, connecting them to the SDGs, and therefore generating practical knowledge about the SDGs and their use in tangible initiatives.
Número 3, en el ámbito de la difusión, desde mayo del 2020 hemos lanzado nuestra plataforma de voluntariado en donde tanto INJUV como organizaciones locales pueden publicar su oferta de voluntariado y o talleres para jóvenes que en su primer año logró 13.655 postulaciones en 304 iniciativas independientes en donde se mide que los ODS contribuyen y se logra visualizar los 3 principios ODS que son el ODS número 17 respecto a la Alianza Mundial para el Desarrollo Sostenible en un 20%, el ODS número 11 que tiene que ver con ciudades y comunidades sostenibles en un 18% y el ODS número 4 relacionado a la educación en un 13%.
When it comes to communications, and since May 2020, we launched our volunteering platform, where both INJUV and local organizations can publish their volunteer offer and or workshops for young people. In its first year, the platform achieved more than 13,000 applications for more than 300 independent initiatives, where it's measured to which SDG they contribute, and it is possible to visualize the 3 main SDGs that have been implemented. They are, first, SDG number 17, World Alliance for Sustainable Development by 20%. Second, SDG number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities in 18%. And lastly, SDG number 4, related to education by 13%.
Por tanto, sabemos que la Agenda 2030 es un importante desafío que merece ser tomado con seriedad por las instituciones públicas, pero si no lo hacemos conectando esta agenda con la coyuntura nacional, pierde fuerza y apropiación por parte de las comunidades locales. Y por lo mismo, desde INJUV hemos potenciado que nuestra gestión siga conectada con lo que pasa en nuestro país. Y este 9 de julio, en el Encuentro Nacional de Voluntariado, las y los jóvenes podrán dialogar y postular 10 propuestas que esperamos entregar a la Convención Constitucional en Chile, que estará encargada de redactar la nueva Constitución, y también a los futuros candidatos presidenciales para que finalmente pueda ser una política pública. Creemos que es fundamental escuchar la voz de las personas jóvenes y por lo mismo es relevante que sean partícipes de esta instancia donde su opinión pueda ser escuchada y validada para una Agenda 2030 más comprensiva.
We know that the 2030 Agenda is an important challenge that deserves to be taken seriously by public institutions. But if we do not do it by connecting this agenda with the national situation, it loses strength and ownership by local communities. Therefore, from INJUV, we have promoted that our management continues to be connected with what is happening in our country. And this July 9, at the National Meeting of Volunteers, young people will be able to dialogue and present 10 proposals that we hope to deliver to the Constitutional Convention, that in Chile will be in charge of writing our new constitution, and also of our future presidential candidates, so that they can finally be considered as public policy. We believe that it is essential to listen to the voice of young people, and therefore it is relevant that they are participants in spaces where their opinion can be heard and validated for a more comprehensive 2030 agenda.
Si quieren conocer más respecto a alguna de estas iniciativas, pueden escribirnos a voluntariado@injuv.gov.cl y felices podremos compartir más información de estas y otras actividades que hemos impulsado como institución. Un abrazo muy grande desde Chile y muchas gracias a todos y todas por su atención.
If you want to know more about one of these initiatives, you can write to us at voluntariado@injuv.gov.cl, and we will happily share more information about the activities that we have promoted as an institution. Thank you so much, and we're sending you big hugs from Chile.
Gracias, Renata. Really appreciate your presentation along with each of the insightful comments in our previous speakers. I'm now going to turn our proceedings over to David Stiers, who is the coordinator for the Volunteer Groups Alliance, and he will introduce the following segment. Thank you.
Thank you, May, and it's such a pleasure to welcome experts in volunteering to continue our conversation today. And first we'll hear from Kyoko Yokosuka, who since April has served as the Deputy Executive Coordinator of the United Nations Volunteers Program. She had previously served as the Chief of External Relations and Communication Section in UNV since July of 2019. And prior, she had worked for 2 decades with the United Nations Development Program in Romania, Uzbekistan, Laos, PDR, and Bangladesh. So thank you so much for being with us today, Kyoko.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity for UNV to present some data today from a multi-country survey that we recently commissioned through Gallup. As May mentioned at the beginning, UNV is currently preparing its next State of the World Volunteerism report, which is also about how we build back better after COVID-19. The report will be globally launched in December this year. The report will explore innovative relationships between people and state through volunteering. And one of the inputs is this multi-country survey, looking at how voluntary action changed during the past year and how people plan to volunteer in the future. So the data I'm presenting today is based on a survey of more than 8,000 people in 8 countries. In Bolivia, India, Kenya, Lebanon, Senegal, Thailand, Turkey, and Uzbekistan in March, April this year. People were asked about what they had done in the past 12 months, covering much of 2020 and early 2021. Next slide, please. So firstly, it should come as no surprise that when a range of different volunteering activities are considered, volunteers stepped up in these countries in a time of urgent need. More than 3/4 of adults aged 15 and above volunteered, including more than 90% in Kenya, Senegal, and Uzbekistan. You can see the level of participation across the countries, but I also wanted to mention that there were high levels of participation across all demographic groups. Men volunteered slightly more than women, although this does not take time into account. Most people volunteered informally, but significant numbers also volunteered through government programs and schemes, from 16% in Bolivia to 42% in Kenya, as well as with a range of other organizations. So how did this change in comparison with the previous year? Next slide, please. This slide shows changes in people's voluntary participation were complex and often without a clear overall pattern when looking at individuals and groups. There was a huge amount of change, so only 1 in 3 volunteers participated at the same level as previously. But in terms of the other 2/3 of people, there was no clear pattern. So when net participation was taken into consideration, some countries saw overall declines in voluntary action, while others saw moderate increase. As you know, volunteering is evidently affected by the interplay of macro factors, such as scale of the pandemic and national responses, such as lockdowns, with more micro factors, such as illnesses. In terms of the participation of different groups, men tended to have bigger increases in volunteering compared to women in the same countries. Unemployed persons and those in the lowest income groups were most likely to have volunteered less during COVID in comparison with the previous year. We know from other research that there is a complicated relationship between the employment status and the volunteering, but we might assume that these people are less able to volunteer as they struggled with meeting their basic needs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one strong feature which came out through the survey was that volunteering related to civic participation declined across 7 of the 8 countries. Civic participation can include, for example, attending a neighborhood meeting or contacting a public official to provide an opinion. The decline in civic participation is most likely due to pandemic-related restrictions that limit movement and face-to-face meetings, for example. Although it was not in the scope of this study, we believe that more time is needed on why civic participation declined so significantly in some countries and not in others. Next one, please. So what happens now? We are still in the middle of the pandemic, which with a long way to go to recover and to get back on track in implementing and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The world has not seen this type of upheaval in a century, and it is likely to have far-reaching impact across how we live and work. So what are people's plans to volunteer in these 8 countries? In this survey, people were asked their plans to volunteer across 5 broad areas, which is listed in the slide. So 1, directly helping friends and neighbors and acquaintances. 2, working as part of a group that provides assistance to others. 3, give opinion to local authorities or help them plan or provide local services. 4, be part of a campaign or initiative to raise awareness of an issue. And 5, contributing new ideas or solutions to an issue or problem, either by yourself or with other people. First of all, while the variation in volunteering levels across countries will start to re-emerge, people still expect to volunteer more than they did in pre-pandemic period. Second, in these 8 countries, only a minority of volunteers will be involved in a single type of volunteering. Most people expect to spread their voluntary activities across a range of issues and arrangements, both formal and informal. Directly helping those outside the family will still be the most common form of volunteering. Next one, please. However, the biggest shifts are likely to be towards forms of volunteering that give people greater ownership of development processes. Even taking dips during COVID-19 into account, in many countries, more than double the amount of people said that they plan to engage in forms of participation, such as giving feedback to authorities or working with authorities to plan services, particularly in countries where this was less common in the past. Similarly, in countries where volunteers have been less involved in generating solutions and innovating around social problems, there is a big jump when looking at people's future plans. Looking from left to right, we can see that, for example, in Thailand, people express a lot of interest in these types of opportunities. And given that the government of Thailand's voluntary national review really emphasizes the role of volunteers in national development, we can see that the demand is there from both sides to work together in future. Next one, please. And this is my last slide. Given the time limitation, I showed just a snapshot of findings, but you can now download the full report from the UNV Knowledge Portal as of today. The fact, so I just wanted to summarize quickly, the fact that more than 3/4 of people across all countries surveyed stepped up during the pandemic is probably no surprise to you at this event. We know that volunteers do step up in times of crisis and in needs. And with only 1 in 3 people volunteering at the same level during 2020 as previously, we are clearly in a time of great change and flux in people's approaches to volunteering. But what is highly encouraging is that volunteering seems to be resilient, judging from the plans of those surveyed. People expect to be involved in a wider range of volunteering activities than they have done in the past, including contributing to social innovation and being more civically engaged. These findings serve to remind policymakers that the economic and social value of volunteering goes beyond the labor provided and services delivered. Volunteering is an important channel for people to shape countries' pathways out of the pandemic and beyond. While this is just some big picture data, I know that my fellow panelists are going to share more with us on what that looks like in reality. This week at the high-level political forum, I'm happy to see that the contributions of volunteers continue to be recognized and acknowledged in voluntary national reviews. Let us ensure that as people's participation through volunteering evolves in the wake of the crisis, that we can meet volunteers' expectations, not only to pick up the pieces where the times are hard, but to be at the center of our global reset. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kyoko, for that very optimistic report, and we'll be excited to continue to delve into this research and data. And it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Nicole Cerlello and Helene Perrault about other recent research on volunteering. Nicole joined the International Association for Volunteer Effort, IAVE, as Executive Director in October 2019. And Helene is the Director of the Helene Perrault and Associates, a South Africa-based consultancy established in 1993. So I will turn it over with no more ado to Helene and Nicole. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to all of our participants today. This is a great forum, and we appreciate being invited to share our perspective on this very important matter, which is volunteering during the pandemic and how it's really shaping not only the Sustainable Development Goals, but progress on social change. So I just want to start by saying I am indeed from IAVE, and I will introduce Helene Perrault, who will take over the latter part of the slides, but I will get us started here. Next slide, please. Thank you. And all of these slides will be available at IAVE with the full body of research in September. So the International Association of Volunteer Effort, IAVE, is responsible for a global network for volunteer leadership. These are organizations in over 76 countries that are responsible for building the capacity of leadership, of volunteering within their country or region. So they are leaders, but they're the conveners of a myriad of volunteering involving organizations in their country. And they are responsible for really building that volunteering and supporting that volunteering and really making sure that volunteering is directed and impactful where they live. We kicked off this network in 2020. And so for the past 18 months, have been working with them, have been doing advocacy with them, networking, mobilization, and really helping them to develop their leadership skills. When the pandemic hit, we knew right away that we wanted to examine these organizations during the pandemic. And so we have just concluded a very large survey that looked at 70 volunteer leadership organizations who responded to a survey and interviews, and across globally, across Africa, the Arab region, Asia Pacific, Caribbean, Latin America, and North America. And we asked them a series of questions about their volunteering experience during COVID-19. And we're going to share those experiences, some of the findings today. Next slide, please. So it won't be any surprise to anyone listening that this notion of leadership and a network was really important to these members. 64% of them said that the global network for volunteer leadership enabled them to connect and share knowledge. And 54% of them stated that the global network provided direct support in addressing the challenges that they encountered in COVID-19. And I think this quote really says it all. In the midst of these challenges and chaos and disaster, we can often feel like we're alone. But when we're surrounded by those who are facing the same challenges as we are, it feels like the challenge disappears a bit. And I think this quote reflects it, the importance of networks and the importance of gathering within those networks in order to face change. Next slide, please. This slide talks about the impact of volunteering and the impact of COVID-19 on volunteering. And really, it talks about what others before me have said, this complexity where volunteering certainly increased and many, many people rushed to volunteer, but at the same time decreased as well due to the complications around health and safety in volunteering. This slide really reflects the fact that despite the pandemic, 55% of respondents stated that they had an increased number of people who very much wanted to raise their hands and become volunteers. And 77% of those respondents stated that COVID-19 had in fact opened up volunteering opportunities to mobilize more volunteering. So whether they were able to issue calls to action or online engagement, 77% of the respondents found that it was easier to in fact mobilize those volunteers. But of course, the opposite, 55% stated that the lockdown also had reduced volunteering, reduced their volunteering and activity in their country. I think we can all think about perhaps older people or people who were not able to, in those early days of COVID-19, due to safeguarding issues, had to refrain from volunteering, or those without insurance, or those who were really felt that they could not leave their family. All of these had the impact of reducing the number of volunteers. Also, 63% of survey respondents stated that they had moved from face-to-face volunteering with their programs. Again, others have said this, but I think what we ought to keep in mind is that this may very well go back. A number of our respondents said that while they had indeed switched from face-to-face to online, that they didn't always think it was better, and that they felt that there were some key components to that online volunteering that were indeed missing. So there is a debate right now about how much virtual volunteering will continue and how much will revert back to face-to-face. And then finally, this item that's bolded, this 84% have really revised their strategic approach to work through online support and engagement. If you really think about all of the changes that we had to undergo and all of the ways in which we could no longer do what we had always done, particularly in those first 3 to 4 months of the pandemic, the amount of strategic leadership and the amount of change that had to happen, and not just envisaging, how do I do this particular act differently, but how do I do everything that I've done differently? It really did present them with a great challenge, but it allowed them to rethink some of the things that they were doing and become more strategic in the process. Next slide, please. And this slide really speaks to this. It speaks to this notion of strategic leadership and how without this leadership and this strategic leadership, the capacity of volunteering likely would not have been able, these people would not have been able to navigate the complexities of COVID-19. So many of them really stated that there's 74% of them that their approach to this strategic leadership had indeed changed. It had been forced to change, but because it had changed, their leadership capacity grew. We're going to come back to this notion of leadership in some of these other percentages, but just quickly, 75% develop volunteering to promote human rights, a respectful society, respectful relationships, and that social change had really become so much more of an important focus on their work. And I think it's important to think about that the volunteering became less of an act of charity and more an act of survival. And particularly as we think about the Sustainable Development Goals and the role that volunteering plays, it took on that approach of being an essential component to not only getting through the pandemic, but to building back in a way that creates more holistic societies. There were other factors around racial equity, particularly certainly climate change, that have added to that notion of volunteering as a strategic component to a more respectful, more relationships and society. But certainly COVID-19 really changed that lens remarkably for many of our participants. 80% of volunteer involving organizations have engaged in coalitions to strengthen advocacy around the health and safety of their own volunteers, demanding that precautions were put in place before those volunteers entered the field, but also advocacy around the role of volunteering in society and what some people refer to as being at the table within government and sectors where important conversations were being had. 76% of volunteer leadership organizations said COVID-19 was a catalyst to develop and review their volunteer policies. Again, I think when you think about needing to suddenly keep your volunteers safe from an incredibly infectious pandemic, you had to really look at your safety protocols and really make sure you were reviewing them so that they met that challenge. And finally, 96% said their own leadership capacity had to change. So the first statistic talks about their strategic leadership of the organization, but this is really about them as leaders. And again, having to really mobilize teams, having to really lead people, having to really build new relationships, their own capacity as leaders increased significantly during the pandemic. And finally, this notion, 69% stated the focus more on activities such as training and consultancy into developing leadership capacity of other organizations. So not only were they developing their own leadership and that of their organizations, but they were reaching out to other organizations within their sphere to build their leadership capacity as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Helene, who will take us on the next several slides. Helene?
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for the opportunity to be joining you. I'm one of the researchers on this study, and it's been a privilege learning from it. This slide speaks to one of the most important findings of our study. And that is that in expanding relationships, volunteer leadership organizations created the partnerships that they needed in order to extend their impact and navigate this unpredictable terrain. So the first point is very interesting, that 90% of them agreed that the new relationships at local level formed during COVID will continue to be important. And I don't know if there's going to be a post-COVID era, but this finding is certainly in line with some of the points that have already been made about the power of local and community-based volunteering. And it is a manifestation of community-based action and what's being called informal volunteering in northern countries and has been very prevalent in the global south, as you probably know. And that is likely to be a bigger focus in future. 52% said that they had strengthened their relationships with companies and 82% with governments. And this is an important figure because while they continued advocating for policy and lawmaking, they were also able to engage more closely. They played advisory roles, and they were able to challenge the lack of recognition in civil society by engaging governments, and sometimes even in a context of opposition, where the volunteer leadership organization would agree to provide technical assistance, even though they did not agree with the government's approach to volunteering, and in particular were particularly concerned about the safety of the volunteers. And there you see the quote that in this country, they participated in launching a national volunteer strategy, and they had become the main lead. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the barriers to volunteering, and we found that the first barrier, as I said, was around volunteer welfare, safety, and particularly the lack of insurance to cover volunteers, mainly against illness. So while they were covered for accidents or other events, they were not being covered in many countries for illness. And yet in the pandemic, that was the central risk that volunteers were facing, and certainly did contribute to the decline in volunteering. There was also a lot of advocacy on the recognition of the value of volunteers and volunteerism, although as we saw from the high level of partnerships that had been struck, that volunteering was increasingly being recognized as a force for action and solutions within the context of the pandemic. But we'll come back to that in a minute. And then there's certainly there was a lot of advocacy on the creation of the supportive legal and regulatory infrastructure and for resourcing. Next slide, please. So following on from that, how do the survey respondents see the future? Clearly, the advent of technology and the adoption of technology, both for operational reasons and for programmatic reasons, is the key trend that we see here. 95% felt that that trend would continue. And then secondly, very importantly, there's evidence of new partnerships emerging at regional level. And so you see these different networks being created within the volunteer sector between different actors at different times. And those were thought to be equally important in about 75% of the respondents. A similar number at 71% felt very importantly that in future programs and mobilization would be more inclusive. And here we're talking about including people who, we saw more people being involved from the affected communities, people who would not normally have been involved in the types of programs. And that opened up a whole lot of opportunities for the volunteering leadership organizations. Also, obviously, based on race, gender, exclusion of people with disabilities, increasingly valuing the role of volunteering in helping people with mental health conditions. And there are other forms of inclusion that we found as well. 62% said that they changed the way their organizations operate and that these changes would be sustained. But then we see a lot of insecurity and uncertainty around resourcing. So 44% of the respondents said that they, in future, they expected volunteering to be, programs to be resourced mostly through social enterprise and earned income. But there was a lot of ambivalence about this. And basically what we're seeing here is that there is not a sector-wide understanding of alternative resourcing strategies. And that certainly creates a level of insecurity among volunteer leaders, organizational leaders. And then 30% felt that the grant-aided funding from governments would play a smaller role in their resourcing. But basically that tells us that the majority felt that it would continue. But this is not in fact something that can be assumed, because a lot of government funds are being redirected to the health sector and other sectors that are directly involved in dealing with the health implications and the resourcing needed for that. So there is a lot of insecurity about that, and I think this is one of the major avenues that we need to look at next. Could we have the next slide, please? And this is the last, almost the last one. So what needs to happen? New relationships and new forms of cooperation are important for future-proofing volunteer leadership organizations at regional, multinational, and local levels. We saw a lot of evidence of organizations needing to prepare themselves. And that included challenging the barriers and the inequalities in volunteering, as we've mentioned. For example, gender, refugees, people with disabilities, and sexual minorities. We found evidence in that across the countries that we interviewed and surveyed. But then the 71% of volunteer leadership organizations did feel that in future, the programs and mobilization approaches would be more inclusive. And I think that speaks quite strongly to that earlier point that Nicole made about a move from purely charitable work to work that has a greater element of social activism in the volunteering space. And then preparing for future disasters, investing in community-led infrastructure for volunteer action. So again, we see the lens focusing on local volunteering on the ground, in informal settings and in informal organizational groupings. And the challenge to formal volunteer organizations is how do they connect with that? How do they have to change their practices? Are the volunteer centers too bureaucratic? Or, and there are other challenges that come forward in the research. We've already mentioned the need to develop safety and security protocols, but most fundamentally, the preparation for future disasters means that volunteer leadership organizations are having to reorganize themselves. They're having to restructure within their networks, both nationally and regionally, and they're having to retool their programs and operations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helene and Nicole, for that presentation. And now, based on what we've heard from governments and from research, we're excited to hear from three outstanding volunteers. First, we'll hear from Ahmad El Zubi, who's the founding CEO of Naua, a non-for-profit social impact platform in Jordan that aims to promote a culture of giving and philanthropy and volunteering by connecting civil society actors within a common framework for measuring impact. Then we will hear from Alexandra Infante Porrales, who's the executive director of Purdue Voluntario, which he co-founded in 2020 as the first formal national volunteering network in the country, whose goal is to promote and integrate volunteering through already existing platforms and networks. Then we'll hear from Kenneth Ramah, who currently works with VSO as a climate change youth advisor, and he also serves as the executive director of the Youth for Sustainable Development, a youth-led, community-based organization that provides inclusive platform for youth to be meaningfully engaged in volunteering, leadership, and socioeconomic well-being in their communities. And then we'll conclude where we started with a special video from a volunteer project in Guinea. So over to you, Ahmad.
Thank you, David. Thank you everyone for having us here today. My name is Ahmed. I'm the CEO of Naua, which is Jordan's national platform for social impact. And in partnership with UNICEF and the Ministry of Youth, we've launched the National Volunteering Platform, which is Nahnu. So I was asked to share a little bit about what volunteers in Jordan did during the COVID pandemic and what their role was. So I'm just going to quickly go through that and try and highlight how definitely their efforts helped achieve a lot of the SDGs, especially 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in Jordan, we recorded our first case of COVID on March 12th. And then by March 15th, borders were closed, no more travel in and out of the kingdom. By March 20th, there was a full national lockdown, so no more movement. Now, when the lockdown happened, there was this new segment that no one really paid attention to, the new disenfranchised segment of society, the daily laborers, informal workers that were doing pretty okay for themselves before the lockdown. But once the lockdown happened, they were outside of any income generating activities. They were not covered by the national social safety network, and they were really left to fend off for themselves. We were proud as Naua to be able to lead the national movement to, number one, raise awareness on their plight, number two, raise funds to try and get some help their way, and number three, to actually mobilize and be able to reach over 85,000 families across the kingdom within the first 2 months of the lockdown. So that was something that was done by volunteers. So not only were they delivering food packages, not only were they, delivering, doing patient transportation or medical deliveries, or not even were they only working on, providing support for remote education, delivering like tablets and internet connections and all that. All that happened and all that's fantastic, but volunteers really had a role in building these networks of emergency response and getting actors within local communities working to raise awareness and deliver support to their communities. And most importantly for us as a platform that serves to connect everyone, they really supported, our work to keep everybody informed and everybody honest. So our volunteers, we were very happy that they did over 10,000 M&E calls, just calling up all of the various beneficiaries across the kingdom to make sure that aid was getting there, it was getting on time, and it was getting there in the right way. So none of this could have been possible if it was only the public sector working, or if it was only civil society. It was a partnership between everyone. It was led by volunteers. And our lesson coming out of COVID is that we were thankfully prepared because we were an online digital platform. Not everyone was at the same level. So that's why we're working with a lot of policymakers and partner NGOs, and happy to be part of EAVE as well, their global leadership network as well, to work on getting everyone ready and prepared to have the same level of excellence moving forward and not to fall into the same mistakes we had. And just wanted to share that story. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, and over to you, Alexandra.
Okay, thank you, UNV, for the opportunity to share the experience of Peru. Peru Voluntario, as it was mentioned, is a network of networks. So when a COVID-19 pandemic struck Peru, as Peru Voluntario worked with a lot of NGOs, corporates, academics, and governments, we managed to get all together, and we asked the question, how can we help, from the volunteer ecosystem? How can we generate value to the country and to everything that was happening? We knew that we were not only facing a sanitarian crisis, we also were going to face economic, social, political, a lot of crises. So we managed to organize all the volunteer ecosystem and say, how can we help? So we see different priorities, and we managed to create different commissions. We create a commission about research, where we identify needs, raise data, follow up initiatives outside of Peru, so we can learn of other countries and other NGOs that were doing a lot of valuable things around the world. We create a commission about humanitarian aid, another of digital volunteer, where we managed to create different volunteer programs in partnership with a lot of NGOs, companies, government, and we do it really, really fast. In other contexts, we wouldn't do it so fast. It was really great because we have managed to create bigger programs that nowadays can help a lot of people. We managed to create a program to help entrepreneurs that in Peru, 90% of the companies are little companies, so they need a lot of help. We also create a volunteer program of education to help the kids that now have homeschool. We also create a commission about mental health, where we also work things related to how to manage anxiety. We work with psychologists, NGOs that have a lot of psychologists. We also find that there were a lot of domestic violence in the quarantine. So we managed to create programs to help women in these homes. We also create a commission of shelters and of communication. So we create like a big movement in Peru with all the networks, all the NGOs, the government, academic companies, and we managed to create a lot of things that help a lot of people. And also we achieved to contribute different NGOs as well, partnerships. That was really important, that really helpful. Also, no poverty, no good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, sustainable cities and communities. No, and it was really great, and we continue doing these programs in Peru, and there's a lot to do. We are still in this crisis. No, the poverty in Peru have go back 10 years. Now the poverty is 30%. Last year we were levels of 20%. So there's so much to do, but we believe that the volunteer ecosystem could help a lot to the country to generate that relief. No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And finally, Kenneth, in your work in Kenya and Ethiopia.
Hello, hello everyone. Thank you, David, and many thanks for the invitation to share my work, experiences and learning based on the engagements I've had with youth networks in Kenya and also in Ethiopia. So I'll also share a few thoughts on how to strengthen collaboration between citizens and the state. So one of my voluntary role is serving as the Executive Director for Youth for Sustainable Development, which is a youth-led community-based organization that provides a platform for youth to meaningfully engage in leadership, volunteerism, social economic well-being, to build the resilience of their communities. So with the support from VSO, other NGOs, civil society organizations, and the government, we have held numerous activities to raise awareness on COVID-19 and address its impact. In Ethiopia particularly, we did a series of risk assessments to establish the kinds of vulnerabilities that communities have with regards to various risks, various stresses and shocks. And so here in Kenya, we mostly focused on staying safe during COVID-19, the social well-being, including mental health, sexual reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, resilience building, and even restoring the livelihoods of the communities, because the pandemic has, like we know, greatly disrupted sources of income for the most vulnerable communities, such as those in informal settlements. So our activities took the form of community radio shows, road shows, social media awareness campaigns, webinars, trainings, workshops, and so much more. And these have been able to reach over 1.5 million people in the last 1 year alone. We have achieved this through engaging with over 700 youths directly, and these are youth from both urban and rural areas in 13 counties in Kenya. And we work closely with different stakeholders, including the government. So some of the thoughts that I have on how to strengthen collaboration between the citizens and the government of the states. The first one is having youth organized into groups. So into organized groups, it could be youth groups, youth volunteer networks, community-based organizations headed by the youth themselves. And this becomes much easier for them to be capacity built, to be able to deliver their mandates as volunteers or what they want to achieve in those communities. It's also easier for the government to step in and support in building the capacities of youth in organized groups. The other aspect would be having citizens be engaged meaningfully in advocacy processes, because with advocacy processes, there is evidence generation that is involved. And this also means that various stakeholders are part of it, including the government. The government will be as collaborators and the citizens won't be perceived as antagonists or those who are fighting government efforts. We've had cases in Kenya where the government has been very actively involved in discussions around the food systems, inclusion of persons with disabilities, and even inclusion of other vulnerable people. Lastly, the government also has a role to play in strengthening collaboration between the state and the citizens. And this is through ensuring that there is accountability and transparency as it delivers its mandates. So there have been issues of mismanagement of funds in most countries, including Kenya. And this takes away the trust of citizens on the people or the leaders who are elected to make the lives of communities better. So the government has a role to play in stepping up and fighting corruption, even abuse of office, so that this can go a long way in restoring the citizens' trust in the government and the government processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. And now a final video from Guinea.
Je m'appelle Kika Fatmata Binta. J'ai une licence en sociologie de l'Université Kofi Annan de Guinée. J'ai 27 ans. Je viens de la Guinée-Conakry, précisément de la commune de Ratoma.
Je m'appelle Diego Regosa, je suis italien, j'ai 42 ans. J'ai deux maîtrises en histoire contemporaine et en anthropologie et ethnologie. Et je viens d'Italie, de Brescia. Moi, je suis un volontaire de l'aide de l'Union européenne. Plus en particulier, c'est un volontariat avec France Volontaire en appui à l'association guinéenne AIE, Association pour l'intégration de l'enfant. Et on est sur un projet de reboisement des têtes de source du fleuve Niger pour favoriser la résilience des populations face au changement climatique. Donc c'est un gros projet pour la capacitation dans les structures locales, de plaidoyer, individuer une stratégie de plaidoyer, individuer des stratégies pour augmenter la résilience, réécrire tous les projets, penser à des outils de formation, faire des fiches de sensibilisation et créer des agents locaux qui puissent mener les activités sur le terrain une fois que nous on est partis.
Cette mission de novembre, nous avons formé des femmes et nous avons effectué des sensibilisations sur les causes-conséquences et apporter des solutions aussi pour éviter la coupe abusive des bois. À la même occasion aussi, nous avons formé les femmes à la fabrication des foyers améliorés qui luttent ici pour la réduction de la consommation du bois dans la cuisson des animaux. Ces femmes seront chargées de continuer la restitution dans les autres secteurs du franconia. Nous avons sensibilisé aussi les élèves et les autres femmes qui n'ont pas été sensibilisées et le reste de la population. La dernière mission que nous avons effectuée, c'était en fin juin. Et cette mission consistait pour nous, du côté volet humain, de faire le suivi de tout ce que nous avons eu à faire comme activité sur le terrain, notamment le suivi des foyers améliorés. Le volontariat pour moi, c'est un don de soi pour un intérêt général, pour non seulement apporter mon aide aux personnes vulnérables et aussi participer au développement socio-économique de mon pays.
Pour moi, le volontariat, c'est un choix de vie. Moi, je suis une personne militante, et donc c'est ma mission de vie, c'est aller partout dans le monde, appuyer des petites associations à se renforcer pour qu'eux ils puissent accomplir ses rêves.
Le binômage a été pour moi des moments de pépite, s'il faut le dire, parce que là, il y a une complicité entre nous et de complémentarité dans tout ce que nous faisons.
Et le binômage, je pense que c'est le grand aspect positif, le surplus de tous ces projets à venir. C'est une chose que ça doit être obligatoire dans tous les projets, je pense, parce que c'est vraiment une expérience magique. Ça permet de créer, de renforcer les capacités des deux personnes, de s'aider.
Well, my goodness, thanks for all of the presentations. I'm sorry we ran over just a little bit, but very inspirational examples from each of the speakers that we've heard today. If you want to continue learning, I encourage you to visit Volunteer Groups Alliance, our virtual exhibit booth that will be presented at the HLPF, and learn more stories of other volunteers that are active and delivering against the SDGs. We also have launched a new website, and we will be posting this recording and the materials that were shared at volunteergroupsalliance.org. So please check that out. And you'll see some amazing stories, but I hope you'll also share some stories with us. And finally, a thank you to all of our speakers again today for their contributions, for the information that they shared, and to our donors for making the work of the Volunteer Groups Alliance possible. I also would be remiss if we didn't thank the 70+ members, organizations that participate with VGA for all that they do every day. And again, thanks to each of you for joining us today. I hope you leave being energized and encouraged to be the change you want to see in the world. We will continue to add resources to the new website over the next few months. And of course, we'll look forward to the State of the World's Volunteerism report from UNV in December. Please stay in touch, and we hope to see many of you next year when we're probably all traveling a bit more, and you can continue to watch this year's HLPF sessions on UN Web TV. If anyone wants to be in contact, I know there was a lot of conversation in the Q&A, but please feel free to reach out to David, and you can reach him at volunteergroupsalliance@gmail.com for additional information or for any assistance. Thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your week.